Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishore Narayan from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Is the US Taliban deal really dead? Did the US President Trump actually plan to invite Taliban terrorists to Camp David, the official retreat of the President of the United States? Is the Afghan government happy that the deal is now more or less cancelled? Will the US government continue to send feelers to the Taliban? What will the Taliban's reaction to all this be? More importantly, should India be happy with the development? Hello and welcome to episode 21 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishore, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. This week, US President Donald Trump announced through Twitter that peace talks with Taliban were off and that he was still looking about a troop drawdown from Afghanistan.
So, what happened is that there was a car bomb explosion on September 5th that killed a US service member and 10 civilians near the US Embassy in Kabul. As per some reports, the American service member was the fourth one killed in the past 2 weeks in Afghanistan. 2 days later, on September 7th, US President Donald Trump tweeted that, unbeknownst to almost everyone, the major Taliban leaders and separately the president of Afghanistan were going to secretly meet with me at Camp David on Sunday. They were coming to the United States tonight. Unfortunately, in order to build false leverage, they admitted to an attack in Kabul that killed one of our great soldiers and 11 other people. I immediately canceled the meeting and called off the peace negotiations, end quote. So now this caused the collapse of the Afghan deal that was being negotiated quietly in Doha, Qatar, between the US and the Taliban. On the Monday thereafter, President Trump further said that the talks with Taliban are dead. As far as I'm concerned, they are dead. We have hit the Taliban harder in the last 4 days than we have hit them over 10 years. So that's the way it is. And end quote. And as for the withdrawing of the 14,000 US troops which are currently stationed in Afghanistan, he said that, and I quote, "We like to get out, but we'll get out at the right time," end quote. Now, Camp David, which is usually reserved for high profile heads of state, is and here Trump had invited Taliban, that too on the eve of the September 11th attacks. The planning for which had originated inside Afghanistan now was deemed as inappropriate by many observers.
Yeah, I think Camp David announcement by Donald Trump was actually the thing that irritated most people, especially because of the fact that you mentioned that it was planned inside Afghanistan by Al Qaeda, but with the active support of Taliban. Anyway, so with regards to the peace deal, remember that the US troops have been present in Afghanistan for almost 18 years. And US President Donald Trump wanted the US to withdraw from Afghanistan. It was one of his major poll promises. He needed an exit strategy where he wanted a structured withdrawal plus guarantees from Taliban to not harbor terrorists like Al Qaeda who could attack the US like they did on 9/11. The negotiations on the US side were led by Afghan American diplomat Zalmay Khalilzad, who actually conducted 9 rounds of discussions with the Taliban in Qatar. with representatives from the Taliban who actually had managed to open up an office in Doha, in Qatar. Now, as far as the deal was concerned, once the deal was signed, the US was to withdraw about 5,400 troops from its five bases in Afghanistan within 135 days, bringing down the total strength of the troops there from 14,000 to around about 8,600. During this time frame, Taliban pledged to not attack US service members during the withdrawal. Also, in exchange for the US drawdown, the Taliban would promise to not allow any terror groups use Afghani soil under their control to plot operations against the United States or its allies. There were some promises on an intra-Afghan dialogue to be held with the civilian government in Oslo, Norway, for some sort of final political settlement.
So now the question was there, that was it a good deal which was being negotiated between the two sides? So now Trump, during his election campaign in 2016 and even later on, had promised to get out of Afghanistan by a certain, in general. Now, there wasn't a certain date he had promised, but with the impending re-election in next November 2020, he wanted to get the troops home before the voters go to the polls next November. Now, Zalmai Khalilzad, has been accused of giving away way too many concessions to the Taliban without any firm guarantees in return. Shushant Sareen, like senior fellow at Observer Research Foundation, in his recent piece pointed out that like Khalilzad had embraced the view as far as back as 1996 when he advocated US engagement with the Taliban regime, notwithstanding its atrocities and deep linkages with Al Qaeda. The veteran diplomat had even accepted the Taliban's false assertion that Osama bin Laden had left Afghanistan at face value, end quote. Now, some have called this deal front loaded in favor of Taliban, where they can get what they want in a US withdrawal and then proceed to easily renege on their end of the deal. The deal did have many other worrying points, like not requiring Taliban to express regret for their past association with terrorist groups like Al Qaeda, calling the democratically elected civilian government under current President Ashraf Ghani as a puppet government, and not allowing them to participate in these failed negotiations. They had also made some vague guarantees to an intra Afghan dialogue between the civilian government and themselves. Uh, at a later stage, like post the withdrawal, when if they were in a dominant position, they could dictate terms to the former. Now, the Taliban reportedly wanted the deal to be first announced in Doha, while Trump would have instead liked to be announced in Camp David, which is where past US presidents have announced major peace deals. So, once the deal was uh, agreed upon in principle, the Afghanistan president Ashraf Ghani was reported to have been shown a copy of the deal between the US and the Taliban, which he was given an hour to read over, but shockingly wasn't allowed to even keep a copy of it for reasons unknown.
Yeah. So two surprises there. One is inviting the Taliban to Camp David, and the most vivid memory of Camp David is the handshake of the Palestinian Yasser Arafat with the Israeli Prime Minister, which kind of had some amount of peace in the Middle East all those 2 3 decades ago. But then the other shock that you mentioned was how President Ashraf Ghani was not allowed to keep a copy of the Taliban US deal. In any way, now what has been the reaction to the collapse of the deal? Now, ever since the details of the deal have been circulated on the media, there has been growing opposition to it. 9 former US ambassadors to Afghanistan, in an open letter, warned against withdrawal from Afghanistan under the terms of the flawed deal. Former critic, now friend of President Trump, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, warned Trump, saying, I quote, Mr. President, if you don't have a counter-terrorism force left behind, even if you have got to deal with the Taliban, which I doubt, but you might, they don't have the capability or the will to protect the American homeland. Unquote. On top of this, reports emerged that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had refused to endorse the US negotiator Zalmay Khalilzad's draft deal because of the absence of any guarantees. The death of the US soldier would have been the proverbial final straw that broke the camel's back and gave President Trump the reason to cancel the deal. Now, remember in 1975, in the then South Vietnam, the United States forces were hurriedly withdrawing with the last few helicopters flying out of Saigon before the North Vietnamese advanced on the city. Even though Taliban does control large swathes of the country, there was no immediate such danger there. That there was no impending collapse of the civilian Ashraf Ghani government. That the deal with Taliban had to be rushed through. After all, the Afghan National Army consists of about 200,000 troops, which is not an insignificant fighting force.
Yeah, so now the coming to the implications of what happened over the past few days. Now it's obvious that like Trump has avoided a bad deal with the Taliban, which was unlikely to bring peace to Afghanistan. Interestingly, in 2013, Hussein Haqqani, Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 11, wrote in an op-ed, and I quote, "Unlike most states or political groups, the Taliban aren't amenable to a pragmatic deal. They are a movement with an extreme ideology and will not compromise easily on their deeply held beliefs." End quote. So Taliban, now free of any compulsions from adhering to any sort of deal, will look to up the ante even with even more deadlier attacks, including attacks on US forces. So the Taliban strategy will be to place greater pressure on the US by attacking US forces before the deal was signed, went already, as they probably overplayed their hand. Now, Mike Pompeo like even remarked that Taliban had overreached with this deadly attack, with this attack. Now, both the US and Taliban for now are back to square one with this no deal. Now, things will probably heat up significantly in terms of violence between the two sides before there is some kind of cool down for both sides to come to the table to talk again. I mean, this is more of a pause in the negotiations versus an outright cancellation of talks. I mean, US will resume contact after a while, as everyone knows that they need to exit Afghanistan to end their longest war in modern times. Now, since Trump has professed a desire to get out of Afghanistan, they could be very well the ones to blink first. Taliban since 2001 has stated that they are fully prepared to wait it out no matter how long it takes. I mean, having time on their side is their biggest ally, as they know that the US resolve to stay in Afghanistan will break at some point in the near future. I mean, there have been some reports that that intercepted communications from the Taliban high command reveal that the message is being sent down to the foot soldiers that US would leave in in a year's time, as when the deal was signed. Now, Ashraf Ghani, who has been completely sidelined in this series of events, had insisted that this month's presidential election, which was to be held on September 28th, be held on time. Now, he seeks a second term and wants to negotiate with the Taliban on settlement with them on the country's political future. Now, as part of the intra Afghan dialogue, between the current government and Taliban, like talks were reportedly going to be held on September 23rd, which is curiously just 5 days before the September 28th elections.
Hmm.
Now, this close proximity of the dialogue would have compromised the election process to an extent, because the upcoming elections would just be a temporary phase where any new structures would have to be negotiated between the two sides before any kind of reconciliation in the future, which might even include any changes to the constitution or the political process of how both of them share power in the future. Also, there have been whispers that the Taliban negotiating team in Doha is not in full sync with the Taliban leadership on the ground, which could possibly explain the reasoning between increasing attacks on the US forces just before the days in when the final talks were to conclude the deal. Now, this creates an additional headache that any deal, even let's say a diluted one in the future, might not be adhered to by the Taliban on the ground in Afghanistan.
Interesting that you say that it raises questions on the Taliban, but on the contrary, it also raises questions on the US walking out of its own negotiations as well. After all, the US walked out of the JCPOA. US is now walking out of its own talks with the Taliban. So questions will be raised as to the commitment shown by the US on any kind of negotiations that it wants to have with any party around the world. Anyway, so we now have to look at what has been the reaction from around the world. The UN Secretary General Special Representative for Afghanistan, Tadamichi Yamamoto, actually briefed the United Nations Security Council on on the situation in Afghanistan and said that the direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban should resume as soon as possible. Taliban, surprisingly on its part, has indicated that it would want to continue the peace talks with the United States. Taliban's statement was, I quote, committed to continuing negotiations till the end if a political settlement is chosen instead of war, unquote. Now, Russia, which was having its own peace talks with the Taliban in parallel, welcomed the Taliban's stand. Russia's official statement was, I quote, we hope that the current pause will not undermine the long term efforts of the two sides and the substantial progress achieved at the talks in Doha on a peace settlement in Afghanistan, unquote. Now, Afghani President Ashraf Ghani has clarified that negotiations with the Taliban are impossible without a ceasefire. He further claimed that the Afghan government facilitated all conditions for peace, but the Taliban miscalculated and that Afghanistan will not be coerced. Ashraf Ghani now comes across as a man whose stand was vindicated. It was true that he was ready to hop on a plane on short notice with very few details to make something happen for his country. Now it is obvious that the Afghan presidential elections will now proceed as planned on September 28th, Mohal, as you indicated, and that Ashraf Ghani is a clear front runner in the polls right now.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
a lot of the candidates had suspended their campaigning because they were not. There's a lot of uncertainty in Kabul regarding this peace deal and when it would be announced. So many of the candidates have actually suspended their campaigning for the elections.
Mm-hmm.
And since now Ganesh, who should be the clear front runner in the polls, just by the power of incumbency.
Yeah, agreed. But also, the other way to look at it is September would be the last possible date by which elections could be held. October onwards, the tough winter months kick off, and it would be impossible to physically conduct an election across the length and breadth of Afghanistan. So it was quite
Mhm.
obvious that either it would happen in September or it would have to be postponed till early spring in 2020.
And I believe they have already been delayed once, right? They were supposed to be held
Exactly,
in spring or early summer, if I'm not correct.
exactly.
If I'm not
Yes,
wrong,
yes.
sorry.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So that was the reaction of the different stakeholders. But now let us look at it from an Indian angle. What has India's reaction been, and how would India look at the entire development? India will have to review its Afghanistan policy to examine how it can play a role in sync with the US interests. Demands for an Indian military role are likely to increase and must be resisted while keeping all other options open, including improving its relationship with the Taliban.
So,
Mind
Kishore,
you,
here,
mhm,
like here, I think just wanted to add that I think Donald Trump made an off the cuff remark that India needs to be doing more, which was taken by many as a comment that India should put boots on the ground. But I think, as you rightly say, and many strategic observers agree that we should be not putting any troops on the ground. It will just be counterproductive and just give an easy target for the Pakistan-based terrorist groups to attack Indian assets on the ground.
right, right. I mean, Donald Trump is known to make such off the cuff remarks. Remember how he had made a back of the hand remark telling, why is India building all the libraries in Afghanistan when nobody is reading any books there?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, Donald Trump's statements should not be taken at face value, is all I would say right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to improving its relationship with the Taliban, remember that India has never had an official contact with the Taliban, and India does not have a very good memories with the Taliban, especially with the Kandahar episode and
Mm-hmm.
the subsequent release of jailed terrorists and all that. So, yeah, the question now is, how can India engage more with other significant powers like Russia, China, and Iran on the vexed issue of reconciliation in Afghanistan? India must use its leverage of good relations with not only these big nations, but also with the Central Asian CIS or former Soviet republics, all of whom share a land border with Afghanistan. All these states have a common interest in bringing peace across the region, which has been elusive for decades. The downside from any flare up in Afghanistan will have security implications for all its neighbors, where there can be a spillover impact across their borders into the neighboring states.
Yeah, I think
Now,
in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the two neighboring states, there have been uh, incidents where the terrorist groups have been operating across their borders and creating security headaches for these countries, especially these two neighbors to the north.
exactly, exactly. And also, historically, Taliban has been the weakest in the northern parts of Afghanistan. So this
Hmm.
actually increases the headache for the Afghan national government. So, as I told earlier, India does not recognize Taliban officially since they grabbed power in the mid 1990s. But since they will be a part of any future ruling dispensation in Kabul, be it governing in a joint capacity with the current government or a hostile takeover of the country, it makes sense to open a dialogue with them. There is not much to be lost in any way of an informal dialogue or whatever you want to refer to it by name. After all, if big powers like US, Russia, and China have no hesitation talking to them, then there are brownie points to be earned by standing on your principle of having then of having no
There are
dialogue with them.
no brownie points. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it would better suit India's interest to at least try to shape the future in your neighborhood, even if your chances of influencing Taliban are remote. Now, one added advantage of talking to Taliban, and if you actually really manage to perform a miracle of convincing Taliban, is to distance Taliban away from Pakistan which will be a advantage for you in the long run. Now, Pakistan won't have to worry about its western borders for the time being, and hence can continue to cause problems for India on its western borders. Afghan fighters and mercenaries will not head over to Jammu and Kashmir immediately, and that helps India gain a major reprieve, albeit for a short duration of time. Remember, we have covered the application of Article 370 and the
Mm-hmm.
implications of the impending US Taliban peace deal in our previous podcast
Episode
episodes.
19.
Yep, and the current episode fits well with what happened in Jammu and Kashmir and how the Indian central government was handling the situation there. So our listeners can actually go back and listen to that episode as well. Now, it is no secret that the route to peace in Afghanistan is through Pakistan. The world will have to exert pressure on Pakistan to renounce its support for terror and exercise their influence on the Taliban to finally bring peace to the region, which has obviously been ravaged by decades of conflict. Whether Pakistan does change its behavior in Afghanistan or not remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think this is the crucial point that Pakistan being in a precarious position, can the other powers exert Pakistan to change its behavior? Because it's not only India and the US, but like as you mentioned, like neighbors like the Central uh, Asian republics, Russia, China, and Iran, which all have a vested interest in trying to bring peace to the region. But whether they can uh, convince Pakistan to do so remains to be seen. Also, like Afghanistan is like very much different from the 90s. I mean, it's like one of the youngest nations in the world. Like it has a median age of 19 years, which
Mhm.
is one of the lowest, excluding Africa. It's the youngest country in the world, and two-thirds of its population is below the age of is like 25 or below. So uh, I mean, one of the slightly worrying aspects could be that, like, maybe two-thirds of the population has very little memory of the Taliban rule, so they might be a little bit indifferent to whether Taliban would be in power or not. But I guess the support for the opinion polls show that the support for Taliban has been very low to begin with.
Right, and because you mentioned the low median age of the general population, these people are actually fed up with the continuous violence that is being observed in the country.
Hmm. Hmm.
One famous quote in the recent past of 1 week was how US reacted to uh, just the death of one soldier and managed to call off the negotiations. But the Afghanistanis themselves had no say in the entire peace negotiations. Now, again, the quote is, your 9/11 is actually our 24/7. It kind of is a very profound statement, kind of implying that we are the ones who are suffering day in and day out.
Hmm. Hmm.
And obviously, we would want to have a greater say in how we want to shape a peaceful
Hmm. Hmm.
Afghanistan in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, the as I said, the population is very young, so there's also highly connected. I mean, still Afghanistan is a rural country by any definition, but from like being 90% rural, it's down to 75%. And I saw some estimates that by within the next 30 years or by 2050, like half the population will be living in cities. So it's quite a bit of a modern crowd which is in Afghanistan, which is well connected and more informed than previously. So we hope that things take a better turn than what it did, like probably like 30 years previously to now. And I think that's where the Indian response comes in. So we have done a lot of assistance work in Afghanistan, including, I believe, like 2 or 3 billion work of assistance. So I mean, but there's always a constant craving. What you hear from the Afghanistanis is to India to participate more in not only the reconstruction effort but also in the reconciliation efforts, and also
Mhm.
provide like more military assistance to have the Ashraf Ghani government like tackle the insurgent groups. But I don't know about the military assistance, especially when we are at a delicate position in terms of intra-Afghan rapprochement. But yeah, I guess we need to at least be more proactive than what we were like 30 years ago, especially as our position has improved vis-a-vis the world over the last 3 decades. Okay, folks. So that's all we had on this episode. Now, listeners, if you are listening to our episode for the first time, each episode we recommend to you any book, article, or uh, read we feel might interest you. So, keeping the practice going, Kishore, what's your recommendation for this week?
Yeah, when we were researching for this episode, I found that the website SNI Wire actually has quite a few good interviews of ex-Indian ambassadors to Afghanistan. All these interviews conducted by journalist and editor at SNI, Amitabh Revi. So I would recommend that people can actually go and watch those interviews. It gives a good insight into how India actually is keenly watching the developments and what India expects out of Indo-Afghan bilateral relations.
Mm-hmm.
And Mohal, what would your recommendation be?
My recommendation is like again, like as you said, like one of the former ambassadors, Gautam Mukhopadhyay. Like he
Mhm.
had a very good article on the collapse of the peace deal and what's the way forward and what should India do in the near term in terms of Afghanistan. So that, dear listener, wraps up today's episode where we covered in detail the collapse of the Afghanistan peace talks and its implications for the entire region and India. So, to continue hearing about such interesting topics, do subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so. It is as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any topics that you would like us to cover. Please do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. This is Mohal and Kishore signing off.